Hello friends, welcome back to the Spookcast. This is episode 12, I think. I don't know, you'll see it in the title. Anyways, welcome back to the Spookcast, the only podcast brave enough to admit that revolutions are about vibes. And today it's gonna get juicy because we're talking about leftism. In fact, we're gonna roast it. We're gonna roast it until it's ash. And then we're gonna spread the ashes in your favorite leftist YouTuber's infinity pool. And guys, we're not here to debate whether capitalism is bad, okay? That's too easy. What's harder is looking at how critique itself has become its most commodified product and how revolutionary thought has been turned into a brand deal. But first, before I get accused of being a fucking Trump supporter or some shit, I'm gonna say one thing. Fuck the right. Obviously, the reason I never mention it is legitimately because I feel like that is self-explanatory. It's a shit show, obviously. The way I see the right in present days, it's just like this, I don't know, like a clusterfuck of entrepreneurial fanboys and like dumbass confused podcasters and crypto fascists and trad wife TikTok creators and women flaunting their internalized misogyny and like political commentators. That's probably the worst part. That like spout some vague traditionalist beliefs. Oh, and some shit about like restoring the Roman Empire and tech bros or something. Anyways, there doesn't seem to be much left to say, in my opinion, about those dumbasses. Everyone knows they suck. I think they even know it themselves, to be honest. But the left, well, the left is tricky because the left didn't sell out. It kind of more aestheticized itself into some kind of plastic version of political irrelevance. And their big notions of revolution have become filtered through spectacle and drained of all essence, and then offered back to us as some kind of moral performance. And I don't like it. I don't like it, okay? I just don't. I think it's dishonest. I think it's insincere. And to be honest, I don't think insincerity gets society and those within it anywhere. So the message is fucking stupid. So today we're going to go full egoist exorcist on the spectacle of leftism to strip it down to the bone to see where it went wrong and what can possibly be done to cope with the loss of all authenticity. So if you've ever felt alienated by the endless identity carousel and you're tired of picking sides in a puppet show, or suspicious that your politics might just be another performance, then you might be ready for this. So let's peel back the layers, let's drop the bullshit, and let's meet the creative nothing underneath it all. Let's go. So this week's Spook of the Week is what I want to call the clout co-op. And to be honest, it's not just one person or event, it's more like a pattern or a spectacle. Or like a scene, if you will, where leftist political energy gets kind of siphoned into optics and parasocial influence and moral performance. So it kind of loses its potential for real confrontation with power. So it kind of looks like politics and it talks like politics, but it functions more like an algorithm. And this is gonna upset the left, of course. But I want to start with Zoran Mamdani. So this is the New York State Assemblyman, right? Democratic Socialist, pro-Palestine. Nothing wrong with homie's value system or whatever. I'm not trying to hate on his values, okay? I don't care. He's just one of those figures who on the surface looks like what many people on the left have been craving. So he's like a progressive politician. He's willing to say the hard stuff, but his style is, I don't know, it seems to me oddly cinematic. At least that's what I see when I look at him. So I feel like his public appearances seem almost engineered for like Instagram reels. So you can find footage of him walking with protesters against gentrification, followed by a camera crew and delivering like perfect sound bites with the kind of deliberate cadence that you'd expect from a media trained actor. I don't know. I'm a skeptic, but I feel like you can practically hear the royalty-free piano music playing in the background, you know? But here's the thing. I'm not saying that Mamdani is bad, okay? Again, his values are his values, like, do you, queen? But I'm saying his symbolic role has taken on a life of its own. And because of this, I think that people unfortunately have a hard time not treating him as a vessel for political hope and like a brand for the morally righteous left. And it's that moral righteousness that is part of the problem. And it's a problem because it doesn't challenge the spectacle, it actually feeds it. So someone like him who may even have decent intentions, even if misguided, someone like him easily becomes the protagonist in like a hero narrative rather than a public servant navigating contradictions, right? So suddenly people start believing that representation is the revolution and that visibility is the end goal and that being right is the same as building power. But I'm like, no, please. Like this shit actually like boils my blood because it's just so upsetting, the inauthenticity that's just kind of reigning in this environment. I don't know, man. I also have to say that I feel like the actual message of this representation is also worth unpacking. I'm trying to give him the benefit of the doubt just as a person, you know, but his platform does center on a kind of progressive urbanism, right? So he talks about tenant rights and anti-gentrification and transit accessibility and, you know, a lot of solidarity, right? And these are, you know, decent causes. Okay, there could be a worse cause, I guess, if there were a hierarchy of causes on the surface, and they can even be like materially impactful at times. But the problem is still that he's allowing this representation mess. Like the deeper framing is still one of moral persuasion. And this is kind of always the same with all politicians. Like there's this hidden agenda, this hidden idea that if enough people can be made to see the injustice, then that will change it. And it's this stupid and honestly debunked ass idea of the politics of illumination, which is presented as transformation, but it's not transformation. And we're all being treated like children. So there's some kind of weird sense of hope that the system can be moralized into submission and that injustice is just lack of visibility. And once exposed, it will dissolve. But that is literally never the case. And that hope is an affectual thing. Like we're being emotionally affected to agree, to shift our perspective into the left political spectrum or, you know, onto the left political spectrum when we are just trying to have like a fucking corn dog or something, you know? And I don't know about you, but I feel like I feel a little manipulated, you know, like my dad is trying to tell me that Santa Claus won't show up if I don't clean my room. But maybe that's just me, I don't know. The thing is, power doesn't dissolve, you know, it adapts, it co-opts, it absorbs visibility like a sponge and it keeps going. So Mamdani's idealism, while, look, I'm trying not to be a bitch, okay? While admirable in some ways, it still clings to the old like liberal spook of progress through awareness. And that becomes a spook when it blinds us to the brutal, non-symbolic reality of how entrenched power actually functions. Okay? So the left is actually aiding this spectacle. The left is promoting this veil being put over our eyes. Meanwhile, the right, you know, dumb as they may be, is not interested in being right. Okay? It just wants to win. It wants to play dirty. It plays dirty and it admits that it plays dirty. It exploits every single weakness. Like it doesn't waste time on discourse about tone or vibes, you know? It doesn't try to look good. It just tries to conquer. And that's why it's working right now, you know? And the left has some major fault in that because it becomes obsessed with opposing the right, as if the goal is to be the moral mirror image. So, you know, like, oh, hey, look, we're not like them. We're the good ones. We don't yell. we process, we therapize, we create safe spaces, we give you language guides, we talk about trauma, whatever. And that fucking moral high ground becomes and feels to a lot of people like a trap, you know? So it breeds opposition, because the more energy you spend proving you're not like the right, the more reactive your politics becomes. So you're not acting from your own will or your own desires or your own ego. You're acting from a defensive posture that's always responding to someone else's agenda. Like, okay, a good example would be like these streamers. Okay, so let's pick out 3 that are on the left, but like on different, I don't know, parts of the spectrum. Okay, so the big 3 in this niche are probably Hassan Piker, Vosh, and Destiny. Okay, so these are like the avatars of the parasocial left, right? So let's start with Hassan Piker. So he's got a massive following, and he brought a lot of people into conversations about class and imperialism, which is great. You know, it's a good thing, whatever, do what you want. And I know this is the most common critique, but bro, it's a fucking valid, okay? He lives in a multi-million-dollar mansion in West Hollywood, and he wears high-end fashion brands while criticizing consumerism, okay? He says he supports labor, but he buys designer fits and streams from a luxury PC setup while reacting to union strikes like it's fucking ESPN. The contradiction isn't inherently damning, but the refusal to address it honestly is. It's a perfect example of how it's mostly all optics and no risk. And then there's Vosh, who on the other hand brands himself as this like edgy anarchist willing to debate anyone. Like, he has done breakdowns of philosophical texts and political theory, but the bulk of his content revolves around drama and takedowns and discourse bait. So he's had these stupid ass moments of advocating causes, but they're always wrapped in like an aggressive debate bro style that prioritizes spectacle over clarity. So the ideology becomes less important than the performance of ideological dominance. So how the fuck are you supposed to take him seriously then, you know? And then there's that guy Destiny, like this, you know, sort of professional contrarian, like Candace Owens, but like on the left, I don't know, type of guy. Like, he's really all about representing the libs, right? He kind of positions himself as like above the fray, so like some kind of post-ideological left-leaning centrist. But what he does is mostly just he spends his time throwing fuel on every possible flame that can keep his pockets filled, so he can like harass female streamers with his dick pics or whatever, you know? So whether it's arguing with leftists about gender politics or platforming reactionaries in the name of free speech, the point is never synthesis or praxis. It's literally to keep the stream going. And here's the issue. These streamers aren't political actors. They are content creators. They're entertainers. And that's fine. Okay, that's totally fine. But the problem comes when people start mistaking their persona for praxis, which is most definitely the case. Because viewers get caught in an endless loop of debate drama and like spectacle politics and moral posturing that never translates into real world action. So, I don't know, it's America, you know? It's politics is TV. And what did Freud say about America again? But what about leftist anarchist heroes? This is also important. Let's talk about that. I actually have a great example, and it might piss you off, but let's talk about Luigi Mangione and how the anarchist left tried to literally turn him into a hero he never wanted to be. So in case you live under a rock and you don't know who he is the dude who a little while ago shot and killed United Healthcare CEO Brian Thompson in what can be described as maybe like a personal act of justice. Because guess what, you silly geeses? Mangione had no formal ties to any political party or group, did he? So his manifesto, if you can even call it that, was more like a stream of consciousness, rant against the healthcare system and bureaucracy and I don't know, the commodification of life itself, right? But bro, within hours of the killing or it becoming public, sections of the online anarchist left began circulating artwork and like memes and fucking t-shirts with Mangioni's face on them. So his name trended, right, for a really long time on X. But Mangioni's act was not like a rally cry. Okay, are you serious? It was a personal rupture. So his motivations were rooted in raw subjectivity and not collective strategy at all. And his so-called politics were tangled with like grief and rage and pain. But that didn't stop certain corners of the left from fucking sanctifying him. So like from turning a singular, like unstable eruption into some kind of romanticized symbol of anti-capitalist vengeance. And it just shows you how easily the left tries to turn things into symbolics, right? Like how easily he was turned into like a saint of the cause without his permission, without his consent. And this is the perfect example of the shittiness of the left, because it took the very real life and story of an individual and stripped him of his like particularity and replaced it with a template. And that's the problem. So even within the anarchist left, the tendency to turn every unique act into a movement mascot is obviously deeply present, and it's super spooky, right? It's not about supporting the person, it's about using the person to reinforce your own symbolic identity. So what do we end up with? Well, we got politicians as Instagram protagonists, we have streamers as synthetic father figures, we have activists as moral mascots, and we have individual stories as anti-heroes for some revolution that they never signed up for. So the spook is really about the spectacularization of leftism. So it's like this obsession with identity and aesthetics over strategy and agency. It's the belief that good intentions and correct language are enough to escape power. But, as Jenna would say, you haven't escaped anything, okay? You've just changed your master, okay? Now let's take a step back, because the spook that we're talking about here, this fucking moral theater, the symbolic identities, and this algorithmic outrage, it didn't just come out of nowhere, okay? It has a history and it has a genealogy. So in the next segment, we're going to trace the historical and philosophical development of leftism in the Western sphere, from its Enlightenment roots to the split between reformist social democracy and revolutionary communism, from the post-68 turn toward cultural politics to today's hyper-mediated, identity-saturated discourse. We'll look at how leftism evolved into the haunted house it is now. So buckle up. All right. I'm never going to say that again. I can't believe I wrote that. All right, so let's dissect the spook. Okay, let's start with the basic question. What the fuck is leftism? But even before we answer that, I think we have to go a little bit further. What came before leftism? So what existed before there was even a left-right spectrum? Before the modern political spectrum emerged during the French Revolution, politics in the West was not taught or was not thought of in terms of left or right. It was more like organized around divine right and tradition and natural hierarchy. So kings ruled by the grace of God, and like nobility held land and power by like birthright. And the church was kind of the moral authority, and like the peasantry existed to serve the social order. So power was very vertical, and legitimacy came from above. So like from heaven, from bloodlines, from ordained institutions, and so forth. And in this framework, rebellion wasn't politics. It was heresy or treason. Okay, so there was no opposition party. There was only loyal subjects, and then there were traitors. And then the Enlightenment begins to kind of unravel this order. So it introduces concepts like reason and equality and secularism and like the social contract. And then suddenly, power is no longer God-given. It's actually negotiable. So people begin to imagine the political as like a human-made structure, and with that comes the possibility of reform and revolution and critique. But what even is leftism? So let's define it. I would say in broad strokes, leftism refers to like a political orientation that emphasizes equality, collective welfare, redistribution of power, and the dismantling of hierarchies. I would say especially those tied to like class and race and gender and labor. So it emerged as the oppositional current to monarchy, clericalism, and conservatism in 18th century Europe. So the term left itself originates from the French Revolution, where revolutionaries literally sat on the left side of the National Assembly. But as we know, leftism isn't just one thing. It's a whole spectrum, from social democrats who want to reform capitalism to anarchists who want to abolish it, from Marxist-Leninists building party structures to queer nihilists lighting them on fire. So there's no singular left. There are lefts with an S. And yet, despite this internal variety, they kind of tend to share certain values, right? They believe in, I would say, solidarity, anti-authoritarianism, at least rhetorically, and a belief in the possibility of progress. So how did this diverse, complex tradition become a stage for moral performance and symbolic identity and digital aestheticism? How do we go from organizing unions to subtweeting each other about who's more decolonized? To answer that, I think we have to go back in time, and we have to go to Germany, and we have to talk about the two most important, in my opinion, and subtly very dangerous philosophers in the formation of modern political subjectivity, which are Immanuel Kant and, I'm not saying the whole name, Hegel. So Kant gave us the idea of universal moral law. So, this is not like to be seen as a commandment from God, but as a rational imperative from within. So you don't obey because you're told to, you obey because your reason tells you it's correct or it's right. So this becomes the foundation of liberal moralism. So the ideas there are like duty, responsibility, and to just basically be like the moral subject who acts from principle. But there's something hidden in this form of internalized control, which is that you're still obeying, but now the command comes from inside, right? A super ego disguised as reason. And I think this is so incredibly dangerous. It introduced something so incredibly dangerous because it kind of internalized this sense of control into our very being. And then came Hegel, who kind of absorbed Kant and turned morality into history, okay? So for Hegel, freedom isn't something that you have, it's something that you develop through conflict and contradiction and then synthesis. So history itself becomes a kind of moral narrative. So the slow unfolding of spirit or Geist toward self-realization. And this is where the left, I think, inherited its like teleological instinct. So the belief that history has a direction and that we're part of some inevitable arc bending toward liberation. And it's also where the tendency comes from to like morally manipulate through dialectics, I think. So not to confront spooks whatsoever, but to refine them and to universalize them and to make them very subtle, right? And this philosophical architecture maps onto real historical shifts. So the French and American revolutions infused Enlightenment ideals with a secularized moral mission. So now it's all about liberty and equality and fraternity. So the rise of liberal democracies and constitutional states attempted to institutionalize these ideals, but in doing so, they often replaced divine hierarchy with rational bureaucracy. So the citizen replaced the subject, but with it came new duties and like new internalized expectations of goodness and rationality and obedience. So as industrial capitalism emerged, 19th century socialist movements, which were partly, I would say, inspired by Hegelian ideas of historical progress, began to conceptualize revolution as both inevitable and righteous. So utopian visions mixed with teleological certainties, right? So the worker became the bearer of moral and historical truth. And these ideas filtered into education systems and governance systems and, eventually even capitalist ideology itself. Because the moral citizen and the productive subject and the socially responsible individual, they all became very important, right? And these are, I would say, very Kantian and Hegelian like blueprints, you know? So in a sense, even resistance is shaped by their architecture, which is why to this day, there's such a, like, escaping that realm, escaping like the realm of rebellion, which has kind of been turned into an industry, is so difficult. So when activists today talk about being on the right side of history or appeal to the ideals of justice or democracy or whatever, social responsibility, whatever, they're not just drawing on radical traditions, they're channeling this long legacy of liberalism as well. And then I also don't want to miss out on talking about thinkers like Jean Locke and Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who introduced the social contract theory, because this is a huge deal, right? Because the social contract theory kind of reimagined power as a consensual agreement between individuals and the state. And this was like a major break from divine right, but it also created a new kind of moral subject, okay? So we have this like rational citizen now who consents to be governed in exchange for protection. And that's the liberal subject, you know? The liberal subject is autonomous, reasonable, and bound by civic duty. And then leftist movements took these principles even further. So where classical liberalism focused on individual liberty and property rights, leftism reinterpreted the social contract as a promise of collective liberation. So not just freedom from interference, but freedom to participate and to organize and to exist with dignity. So liberalism said, let's protect the individual, and leftism said, let's transform the conditions that produced domination in the first place. But these frameworks greatly overlap. So the language of rights and equality before the law, of the universal human and all that, they all carry with them very liberal assumptions. So even as leftism deepened the critique, in a sense, it remained entangled with the architecture of Enlightenment humanism. And it's this entanglement and this tension between moral individualism and collective emancipation that continues to haunt the left to this day, in my opinion. And Hegelian logic tells us we're not just doing politics, we're participating in like a grand metaphysical development, okay? It kind of essentializes and universalizes this idea that kind of thinking is intoxicating too. And it saturated what came after, you know? Because like Marx was a direct reaction to Hegel's logic. And it kind of, to this day, creeps into every activist who thinks that their cause is on the right side of history. So let's start at the beginning. And like not the beginning, because we already did that, but the Enlightenment, where leftist thought, as we know it, starts to really form. So thinkers like Rousseau and the French revolutionaries kind of, you know, put down the groundwork with their belief in rationality and universal rights and progress. And early leftism was about humanity. So it was a belief in the inherent stability, in a sense, of man, and a conviction that society could be restructured according to reason. And then came Marx, who turned the whole moral question of injustice into a materialist science of history. So for Marx, leftism isn't any longer about ideals. It's about class struggle, period. So the working class is no longer a moral subject, but it's a historical subject. But even Marxism is haunted because like it's haunted by the idea that history has a telos, right? That emancipation is coming and that there's an end to be reached or a final revolution. And that belief in destiny becomes like a kind of secular religion. So, you know, if we're going to fast forward to the 20th century, then you kind of see this, okay? Because we have a split. So we have a split between social democracy versus communism. So one side tries to humanize capitalism in a sense through welfare states, and then the other tries to abolish it altogether. But both get institutionalized, and they get bureaucratized and they get professionalized, okay? So they form parties and they negotiate with power, and eventually in the West, they very much lose their teeth, okay? There's no longer much talk of revolution, but let's move on. So by the time we get to the 1960s and 70s, the left turns very much inward, okay? So it moves from like factories to universities and from labor to identity. So we have thinkers like Herbert Marcuse, which is leftist critique, right? But that leftist critique starts focusing on culture and sexuality and aesthetic. So what he did was that he warned of what he called the one-dimensional man, where consumer capitalism absorbs all opposition by selling it back to you. And this is very important because it shows you something about what was going on at the time. So what he sees is how even rebellion is getting repackaged now, right? And sold and commodified. And then comes May 68, right? Situationism. So Guy Debord and the idea of the spectacle come into play, and this is like my way of kind of like looking at history, because I don't have very much historical knowledge, but I do have some philosophical knowledge. So I'm kind of looking at like the ideas that popped up to kind of look at what was going on at the time. So Debord says that we don't live in a society of production, we live in a society of images, okay? So revolutionary energy doesn't disappear, it gets captured. And every single radical gesture becomes like a photo op. Like every slogan is now being turned into merch. This is kind of when all of that starts popping up. But in this period, the left also becomes a site of like incredible innovation. So there's new social movements that emerge, and they don't emerge just as distractions, but actually as necessary expansions of the revolutionary horizon. So there's feminist theory, okay, that challenges the patriarchal blind spots of class reductionism. And there's queer liberation movements that like destabilize fixed identities and compulsory norms. And there's black radical traditions and indigenous sovereignty struggles and third world liberation theory and, you know, whatever, all this kind of stuff that kind of try to bring down the old system of colonialism and white supremacy and imperialism, and do that by analyzing its core, right? So the left doesn't just react, okay, it also grows, and it has had a very important part in like philosophical history. You know, we have thinkers like Angela Davis and Frantz Fanon, and like they inject leftist politics with new blood, which is super important. So we have new vocabularies, we have new geographies of struggle, we have, you know, new kinds of resistance. And, you know, then there's Foucault. So Foucault adds like a deep critique of power to the mix. So he tells us that like power doesn't just repress, but it also produces subjects and norms and truth. And like the left absorbs this information, right? And it kind of tries to adopt it into its like essence. And it kind of begins to understand that liberation has to operate not only at the level of material conditions, but also at the level of discourse and identity and like everyday life. And then in the 1990s and 2000s, there's like alter globalization and anti-austerity movements that kind of challenge neoliberal hegemony with creative direct action and like international solidarity, and, you know, things are opening up and horizontal organizing models and all that. So we have platforms like the World Social Forum that become like experimental grounds for imagining post-capitalist futures. We have like Occupy, and we have Black Lives Matter and Standing Rock and all that. And they all mobilize critique through both like symbolic and material confrontation. And each movement builds on the last, and it uses new tools and new alliances and new, you know, political grammars. And today, the left is definitely still in motion, right? It's messy, it's fragmented, and, you know, it's a little bit inconsistent, but it's alive still. So we have like abolitionist praxis, we have mutual aids, you know, talks still. We have tenant organization, we have a lot of, you know, queer and decolonial theory. So the left is continuously reworking itself, and it's often doing that under brutal conditions of surveillance and burnout and repression. And I think it's a very positive thing. Okay, it's great. actually gotten a lot of like understanding from like reading leftist theory. So it's easy to just like mock the excesses and the jargon and the purity spirals, right? But it's also important to remember that there are people out there fighting, okay? And they are legit, like they mean it. They fight for housing and for land and for life every single day, you know? But the question is, how do we distinguish between those fights and the spectacle? Because the spectacle is a serious problem for the left that I don't think the left is willing to truly look at in the way that they should, which I think the man, the myth, the legend, Max Jenna would actually very much help with if they gave it a shot. This is what I want to look at now as a kind of critique of that. So I want to look at Max Jenna's The Ego in Its Own, specifically his, third chapter, I think, titled The Free. So Jenna didn't just reject the church or the state, right? He rejected all sacred abstractions, right? This includes morality, progress, humanity, justice, okay? And he did that for a reason, because he didn't take them for what they pretended to be. And he saw the overall danger of them. So for him, these were not liberatory concepts. They were spooks, right? They were empty ideals that haunt us and that demand allegiance and ultimately rob us of our ownness. So in the third chapter, he launches his critique of the post-Enlightenment liberal and leftist movements, and he begins by targeting those who consider themselves free, like the liberals, the humanists, the socialists, and even the atheists. And he argues that their freedom is illusory. So what they call freedom is simply obedience to a different master. Not God or a king, but like man, reason, truth, humanity, and so forth. So in his words, he kind of says that the left may think it has overcome religion and tyranny, but it has also replaced one sacred order with another. Instead of kneeling before the church, we now kind of kneel before the people and the revolution and equality and justice and these kinds of ideals. So Jenna is especially critical of the way these new ideals function as moral demands. So the free person in leftist discourse is still trapped in a system of duty and guilt. And the guilt part is a huge deal because they have to still serve the cause and they have to prove commitment and they have to sacrifice desires for the higher good. And Jenna basically says that this is bullshit. It doesn't work. Okay, so therefore he, in his language, in his style, mocks the moralism as just a secularized Christianity. So instead of original sin, we now have privilege, and instead of salvation, we now have liberation, and instead of God, we now have humanity. So he notes how liberals and socialists speak of society and the common good with the same reverence once reserved for God. So the difference is only cosmetic in a sense, because these movements still depend on universal ideals that kind of place the individual below something higher. And they still demand sacrifice and purity and faith, only now the game has a different name. You know? And Jenna's target is not just the obvious ideologues, okay? It's also like left humanists who think that society has to be remade in the name of man. Because again, for Jenna, the idea of man as an abstract collective moral being erases the unique individual, and it makes you a representative of like a species and like a bearer of moral weight rather than a singular desiring like embodied self, okay? So he writes, man is the beginning of religion, God is its apex. The God was the heavenly man, the man is the earthly God. And in the end, Jenna refuses all sacred causes in his text, as we know. So he doesn't want freedom, justice, or revolution, not because they're bad, obviously, but because he wants ownness, right? He wants to claim his ownness. He wants to own himself, which is like the experience of being fully, shamelessly, and powerfully oneself and unconstrained by external ideals altogether. So in a way, he sees in leftist discourse, especially in its most moralizing and collective forms, like a profound danger because it resembles the replacement of one master with another through the process of putting a veil over one's eyes and playing with people's feelings and emotions. And this is not a reactionary argument, okay? He's not defending tradition or order or hierarchy. He's not a fucking fascist, okay? He's attacking all systems that subordinate the individual to a general idea. So while the left may have dismantled monarchs and popes, okay, I don't want to take that away from them, Stena asks, have you dismantled the spooks in your own head too? Okay, and this is important, because unless you've done that, this is simply bullshit, and it means nothing, and it could never make a difference, okay? All right, in the next segment, let's look at just that. Let's look at ownness. Let's look at what it means in relation to leftism and what can make a difference, if at all possible, and what isn't bullshit. Okay, here's the question that triggered leftists get so mad about when they discuss Stena. If political, social, and moral values are haunted by abstractions, does that mean that we have to live without values entirely? And here's my answer for you. Calm the fuck down. Stena doesn't say abandon meaning, okay? Re-fucking-lax. He says abandon false obligation. In that way, then, living ownness means realizing that values don't have to be shared scripts that we all recite in unison, okay, like the fucking Pledge of Allegiance, and that they don't have to be issued from like a party or a movement or a manifesto or a fucking trending post on Instagram. They can be owned by you. They can be yours. They can be written and they can be rewritten in your name with your fucking handwriting. So this doesn't mean living selfishly in the narrow, petty sense. It means asking yourself, what do I actually want? What relationships, causes, or ideas matter to me because they serve my enjoyment, my strength, my experience of myself, and not because they signal my virtue to an imagined public, okay? If that is your joy, then you're a slave to the other, and that is not the same thing as self-ownership. But to understand that, we have to look at desire. So let's take a deep breath. Do it with me. ASMR style, okay? Breathe in. And let me tell you some shit. So, under capitalism and social media, desire is constantly like rerouted. So it's turned into productivity, it's turned into branding, and it's turned into lifestyle. And your rebellion becomes a product. Your guilt becomes an incentive. So you get sold a revolution in the form of aesthetics and discourse and like calls to do better, to improve. But your ownness, which involves like an alignment with your desire, gets lost. But when I say living ownness, what I mean is more about reclaiming that alignment, okay? It's about creating a personal thing, not something based in universal morality or shared ideology, but in lived desire or in relational honesty and in reflective contradiction. So you can build ethics without building altars, okay? So yeah, at first, this looks like rejecting spooks, which doesn't ultimately have to mean rejecting like platforms that profit from moral spectacle. If your legit self-enjoyment involves supporting them, okay? But let me explain that. The way I look at it, it's undoing the development that Stena discusses in the first chapter of his book. In this chapter, he explains that the individual goes through 3 stages, if they're lucky, okay? So Stena maps out the journey of the individual in 3 stages. There's the child, the youth, and the adult. Or more precisely, there's a move from the physical to the intellectual to the self-possessed or the owner. So first, childhood is a stage of like appetite and dependence. There's just instinct. It's very, much like what Freud talks about when he talks about the id being like our first stage. So you scream, you eat, you shit, you cry, you sleep. So you don't moralize your actions. You just kind of are. You're just in a state of being. And then comes youth. So this is the stage where you get like infected with ideals, right? Where you start being told what's good and what's not good, what's acceptable, and what it means to be a good person, a good comrade, and like a good leftist, okay, in this case. So you start chasing truth and justice and morality. And not because you know them, but because someone handed you a ghost story and told you to make it your god, okay? So this is where most people get stuck, because they become like haunted by meaning. Okay, this is what kind of Shanna means when he talks about spooks. You're kind of haunted by meaning, and you're addicted to approval and operating within systems that you didn't choose, but now you believe in them and you kind of believe that you have to serve them, and you don't really question it. And this is the age of the cause. And if you're terminally online, the stage can last forever. No, I'm just kidding. It actually lasts forever for a lot of people, especially boomers, and they're not terminally online. So I take that back. Okay. But Shanna's point is that there's like a third stage, okay, which is like a stage that most people never reach, which is the egoist, okay, or like the possessor of the self, the one who appropriates instead of believes. And I know for some of you this sounds cold, maybe, like it's like a lonely space or something, you know, like it's nihilistic, but it's not that. It's more like freedom without illusion, you know? It's living from the inside out instead of performing the outside in. So to understand this, to understand that this happens to you is basically the beginning of becoming unspooked, or like despookification. And this is where psychoanalysis helps too. At least it helps me, because it explains desire, and the desire is part in this. So because to do this, we have to understand that we're not in control. This is the first thing that we have to understand. But if we're willing to align with the power of our desire, then we can get as close as possible. So let me explain that a little bit. So Jacques Lacan tells us that desire isn't just about what we want, it's about what wants through us, okay? So it's shaped by fantasy and lack and social scripts. And unless we bring those unconscious structures into awareness, we'll keep chasing the spooks, okay? And we will keep mistaking someone else's dream for our own desire. So living ownness means disrupting that chase. And it means looking at your desire and asking yourself, is this mine, or was I taught to want this? And this is like the most important question, especially for like the early stages of, you know, kind of living this philosophy. And yeah, the reason why most people never do that is because that kind of reflection can feel like a loss, like letting go of an identity and a community and a sense of being someone, right? It might even feel like kind of like a personal death in a way. But Shanna says what dies isn't you, right? It's what was never yours to begin with, okay? And from that death, there's something weirdly liberating that kind of emerges, which is like a life without obligation, and not even in some like liberatory sense. It's more like, I still hate rejecting my family on Christmas or telling them I'm just not feeling it, so I don't, okay? But I know for a fact that I am doing that for myself, that I'm doing it because I want it that way, okay? And not because I feel guilt or shame or whatever. So it kind of becomes like your life doesn't really change that much. It's just that your level of awareness changes, you know? So it kind of becomes a life where desire doesn't need to be justified, and where your love and your rage and your creativity, or even your withdrawal, all kind of get to be yours. Not because they're pure, but because they're like lived. But let's take this back to leftism, because I have a point to make. And for that, I want to challenge one of the leftists' most intimate and psychological notions and ideals, which I think the most toxic one is solidarity. At least in Germany, I think it's horrible. We even have a tax for it, okay? So, what is solidarity in a psychoanalytic sense? So we often treat it like gospel. Solidarity means showing up and standing beside and being in struggle with, okay? So it's a gigantic, massive spook if you look at it from a Schneiderite perspective. But rarely do we interrogate what kind of bond it actually is in the case of solidarity. And here's where psychoanalysis cuts through that sentiment. Solidarity is often less about mutual liberation and more about mutual reassurance. So it's mostly imaginary. Okay, not in the sense that it's fake, but in the Lacanian sense. So it's like a mirror structure. You know, like I'm good because I stand with the good. So we're right because we're oppressed, or we're together because we hurt in the same way. But the horrifying, tragic thing is that this is not actually intimacy, even though it's sold to us as that. It's just fusion. It's more about identity than anything else. And that's where it becomes problematic, because this is the fantasy of merging, and it cuts to like a person's deepest desire to be seen and to see and to have clarity and to have connection, right? Because this is the fantasy of merging. And what happens when your actual desire contradicts that shared fantasy? What does that mean about you? When you are no longer able to perform the role of the comrade or the ally or the survivor or the activist, you have to be absolutely fucking terrified of being completely rejected or devoured. So the narcissism of minor differences kicks in here, right? You start tearing down people in your own circles, not because they betrayed material solidarity, but because they violated like the moral vibe. Okay, so solidarity in this case can very much, in a toxic sense, become a performance of coherence, and guilt is the glue that holds it together. And this is where Shena comes in with something far more unsettling, and in my opinion, far more honest, which is that instead of idealizing togetherness, he proposes a different model. He says, let's form a union of egoists, okay? So this isn't a party, obviously. It's not a community. It's not a collective identity. It's a voluntary association between individuals who retain their ownness, who come together not out of obligation or duty or shared belief, but because it serves the individuals within it. And that honesty is obligatory in this case. So it's a living relationship that is constantly reevaluated and never sacred. And when it no longer brings joy or strength or interest or whatever, it dissolves, right? And it dissolves without guilt and without shame. It's just movement. And this doesn't make it weaker, it just makes it more real, because in a union of egoists, no one is faking it for the cause. No one's pretending to care out of fear of exclusion. Okay, no one's shamed into participation or forced into moral performance. And this is because nobody in the union of egoists is afraid of exclusion. So you show up because you want to, and you leave when you don't. And the whole structure rests on that honest desire and not on abstract ideals. And obviously this is deeply threatening to the left's sacred idea of solidarity. You know, literally try it. Try arguing solidarity with a fucking leftist and see what happens. I'm almost 100% sure you'll find dogma and guilt, okay? And soon it'll sound like they're accusing you of heresy. So, Shena's egoist doesn't need a congregation, okay? They just need play, appropriation, and temporality. They know that no bond is sacred, not even love, not even friendship, not revolution, nothing, okay? But this isn't atomization. This isn't liberal individualism, okay? This is not Ayn Rand, okay? Excuse me, I just threw up in my mouth a little. This is something much stranger, and it's much messier. It's a form of life where relationships are not fixed roles, but living exchanges, okay, where care is real because it's chosen, and conflict doesn't mean exile. It's where withdrawal isn't betrayal. And in a way, it's the only kind of solidarity that's not haunted, because it's not based on fucking sacrifice. It's based on desire. So maybe the problem isn't that we have too little solidarity. Okay, maybe it's that we keep trying to build it on spooks, on guilt, on purity, on fucking branding, instead of building it like Stena suggests, which would be something flexible and real and egoistic. a union that's always yours because it's never not up for negotiation, we got this bullshit. We got the solidarity bullshit, which ultimately just excludes and builds like collective identities, And yeah, Jenna's version is scary, it's lonely, it's vulnerable, okay? It's terrifying. But it's also alive, and maybe that aliveness and not fucking righteousness is what we should be aiming for. So that's the union of egoists. That is my challenge to solidarity. Okay? And this is living ownness with others, but never under them or above them. So the egoist doesn't deny solidarity necessarily. They just insist it be based on mutual interest and not guilt. So the egoist doesn't reject community, but they refuse to sacrifice their aliveness for an imagined people that never speaks back. So to live ownness is to live without the algorithm in your head. It's to drop the influencer superego, okay? It's to stop watching yourself from above and to become strange to the spectacle and intimate with yourself, with your own needs, your own pace, your own rhythm. And that's not apolitical necessarily. That's just post-spook, okay? Alright, it's time for our final segment, the spotlight, where we shine some light on a piece of writing that haunts or illuminates the theme of this podcast. And today I've chosen an interesting essay, which I actually just found and read very quickly, which aligns with and also slightly challenges leftism from within. So we have Jodi Dean's essay, From Allies to Comrades, from her book, Comrade, an essay on political belonging. So let's start with structure. So Dean's essay has a very clear arc. So she begins by mapping the failures and limitations of the ally model in contemporary political movements. And from there, she shifts into a philosophical and political genealogy of the term comrade and how it has like historically structured relationships, not around identity or individuality, but around political sameness and commitment. And then the essay builds into an argument for reviving the comrade as a figure who exceeds individual moral standing and becomes part of a collective horizon. So it's methodical and deliberate, or like a scaffolding of argument built to carry both nostalgia and critique, I would say. All right, let's talk about style, because I thought that was interesting. So I feel like she really writes with like disciplined clarity, which is something that I really appreciate. So she's like an academic, but she does it without being sterile. And like she's very emotionally resonant without slipping into sentimentality. And that's not an easy line to walk, honestly. So there's like a rhetorical sharpness to the text, and she constantly moves between theoretical language and grounded like political arguments. And you can tell she's trying to resurrect something dead, but she's not doing it in a way that like romanticizes it, which is something that I fucking hate, honestly. So her tone is neither utopian nor melancholic. It's just really committed in a sense. And that's the key. So she doesn't write like someone trying to be seen as like a good leftist. And I think this is very important for her argument. She more writes like someone who actually believes in it and in building a political collective, which is going to be ultimately her argument. Yeah. And, you know, she's very appreciative of the mess and contradiction that is leftism. And as an egoist, I can very much appreciate that. Now let's talk about the key arguments. So the big one is this. The concept of the ally has failed. Okay, that's the main argument. So she critiques the ally model for being fundamentally tied to liberal individualism, which is, in her opinion, a structure where politics becomes a question of identity performance and like moral positioning and personal guilt. So, you know, if you listen to the previous segment, I very much agree with this. Then, in her view, the ally is always at risk of becoming like a voyeur or a savior. So someone who maintains the structures of privilege while also feeling personally absolved, right? So in her opinion, this dynamic, because of the influence of like liberal individualism, it reinforces that inequality rather than challenging it, because it puts people in like a kind of psychologically difficult position, and in a position that they may not even understand themselves. So the ally doesn't challenge capitalism or build shared struggle. They actually demonstrate awareness, and they perform deference, and they recenter themselves, okay? And then she talks about the comrade. So for her, the comrade is not about who you are, but about what you do with what you commit to. So there's a difference, right? So she positions the comrade as a subject form that resists the fragmentation of neoliberal identity politics. So the comrade is interchangeable, not in like a dehumanizing way, but in a way that prioritizes political relation over personal narrative. So the comrade is equal in struggle, you know, like that would be like the definition for it. There's a quote that I wrote down where she says, "The figure of the comrade erodes the individualizing metrics of success and goodness through which neoliberalism produces subjects." And that's like a strong statement, right? And it fits very neatly into everything that we've said about the spectacle, right? So while so much of leftist culture today revolves around being perceived as good and right and ethical and aware and all that shit, she's asking us to build bonds that don't require this performance. So in a way, she's trying to like save leftism from the spectacle through the idea of the comrade, right? Now, here's where it gets juicy for us egoists, okay? Because I feel like her revival of the comrade is interesting because it's strategic and it's nostalgic and it's actually structurally sound in a way, but then her whole argument misses the point because it still rests on this belief that we need political belonging rather than just saying it's not working because it's simply total fucking bullshit, okay? So this is what makes her book a powerful text to spotlight, in my opinion, because it offers a diagnosis of the spectacle of allyship from within, and it says exactly what I've been trying to say here. So you don't have to swallow the whole comrade framework to actually recognize that she's putting language to a collective ache, right? Which is the exhaustion of moral performance on the left and the desire for something real. So I think what we can get from this text as, you know, egoists is like clarity about the left, okay? So she's not anti-left, obviously. She's very much pro-left. Like, she's not trying to dismantle the project of communism or something, or a collective struggle. What she offers is a correction from within, which gives me a sense of ease because I can see that people are still thinking even if they are stuck in that world, okay? And yes, while it sucks that her alternative still hinges on a shared ideal, we can take that understanding and feel validated in our egoist understanding of the fakeness of leftist moral superiority, and also understand that there is that understanding on the left as well. If you've read my essays, you know I've argued that the left doesn't just get caught in spectacle, that the main problem is actually that it becomes spectacle, right? That its performance of critique becomes a currency, and that it's like solidarity becomes branding, and it's like moral affect becomes a replacement for meaningful change. And I think she sees this too, and you know, that makes me feel better. So obviously an egoist would want to live without titles altogether, right? Without mandates, without belonging. Like Shinna's critique of the free and the ego in its own kind of cuts directly through Dean's revival by saying that any system that relies on shared values, even revolutionary ones, becomes a new religion. And you know, this is kind of the blind side here. Like, she's trying to find a solution to this problem that still like acts from within the circles of leftism. And I would say, and I think Shinna would agree, that this just doesn't work. So maybe another value in her text is also what it exposes, right? It's not so much about what it solves, but what it exposes, which to me is that even the most intelligent, grounded critiques of the left from within can't escape the need for symbolic order. And maybe that's the real split between the Comrade and the Egoist, which is that like one seeks to remake the world together and the other kind of walks away. Anyways, it's a good text. I think you should read it. I'll share the link in the description. But before we close, I always get in trouble for not having some kind of solution to something, which I don't believe in solutions, but here you fucking go. So before I close, I want to speak a little bit more plainly about what I see as real problems with the contemporary left, not just as someone who critiques it theoretically, but also as someone who's been inside it, okay, and breathed it and wanted to believe in it. So first of all, the left in its current state is addicted to self-performance. We've already been through that. Like identity, pain, morality, victimhood become capital, and platforms like X and TikTok and all this shit, you know, it's very much like a trading floor for that. And that kind of pisses me off. And it's not that people aren't sincere necessarily, it's that sincerity itself is suspect, right? It's now part of like a visible repertoire. So how oppressed can you be? How ethical? How aware? How radical? And how legible can you make that for others to consume and validate? So it's a political theater with like rotating lead actors and everyone's afraid of being irrelevant, you know. Second of all, the left has become reactive, okay? It positions itself almost entirely in opposition to the right. So its language, its values, and even its aesthetics are defined by the inverse of conservative ideology. But when you define yourself solely in reaction to an enemy, you're still letting them script the terms. And there's no autonomy in negation alone, period. Then I think there's the issue of moralism. So not ethics, but moralism. So like a suffocating culture of guilt and shame and cancellation and purity politics, and it's just so fucking exhausting, right? It flattens complexity, it infantilizes discourse, and it makes everyone more paranoid than free. And it often reproduces the same mechanisms of control and hierarchy and judgment that it actually claims to oppose, just like in different outfits. And then with like Mamdani, for example, we have the issue that the left fails to understand power outside of language. So it believes that like naming something or posting about it or whatever is the same as resisting it. And it trades action for discourse and embodiment for optics. So it wants revolution without rupture, and it wants change without chaos, and it wants community without discomfort. And that just doesn't work. So when I talk about egoism and ownness, I'm not trying to be edgy. So I'm pointing to a real act, which is that in most of contemporary leftist culture, you know, there's a absence of desire that isn't already sanctioned. So the absence of rebellion that isn't stage ready, for example, or the absence of people willing to be politically incoherent if that's what it takes to stay true to themselves. And this is where I think Makshina comes in and becomes indispensable, to be honest. Like, I think that Shina's philosophy is super unique in that it's a critique of ideology, right? But it's more than that. It's a kind of like conceptual immune system, you know? In a political world that's constantly trying to rebrand domination as care and morality as collectivism, Shina brings us back to the raw site of experience of the individual, right? The individual, the embodied, the one who says no, not out of dogma, but out of like his gut instinct, you know, out of contradiction and out of self. So his idea of ownness is not self-care. It's not neoliberal individualist empowerment at all. It's the ongoing process of refusing to be reduced and refusing to become a token in someone else's narrative. And that refusal and that rejection of being turned into a symbol is what can keep revolutionary movements from becoming a fucking joke or a fucking commodity. So in revolutionary circles, the danger isn't just the enemy outside, it's very much the abstraction inside, and that's often ignored. So the point where the movement forgets its origins and starts to require loyalty, this is a huge issue. And Shina is like this constant reminder that loyalty and duty and purpose, that these are just more refined chains, and they have a philosophical history, okay? So Shina, in a way, safeguards the revolt against instrumentalization, and he reminds us that we don't exist for revolution, and that revolution exists for us, and it's personal. So he challenges us to reclaim self-interest, and not in the fucking Ayn Rand sense, okay? Not in the capitalist version, but in the lived, fluid, messy way, okay? The personal way, the egoistic way, the kind that's always incoherent, okay? It doesn't have to be coherent to anyone. The kind that might not get likes, okay? The kind that isn't explained, it's just lived. And in that space, something real can grow. Not a better ideology, but a way of being that resists becoming a function. So Shina doesn't give us movement, he gives us a compass. And maybe that's exactly what we need right now. Not more scripts, but the courage to walk off stage. And that is why I think Shina matters. And that's why we keep coming back. And that's why we're not done with this podcast. All right, friends, thanks for tuning in. We're going to be back next week with the topic of romance. Okay, so if today's episode left you slightly disoriented, but also somehow more yourself, then you're definitely in the right place. Now, if you want to go deeper, check out our project at theunspookproject.com. We're cooking up some stuff. We already got a Zion called The Creative Nothing. We got regular content unpacking all the ways the spooks of modern life dress up as freedom. You know, therapy speak, gender moralism, aesthetic leftism, trauma discourse, hustle culture, all that bullshit. If you vibed with this episode, then please hit subscribe. And if you're really about that egoist life, leave us a review, support us on our site, or just send a message from the void. If you have a spook you are particularly haunted by, you can submit it and I will discuss it at some point on this podcast. If you have some stuff to say and want me to give you a shout out, or you want to present a project or something, let me know. That's what I'm here for. And also, if you want to be on this podcast, we can, do that as well somehow. I don't really know how, but we'll figure it out. We're currently working on a Shina library, which pools all Shina and egoism related work in one place so you can easily find it and stuff. Anyways, I'm tired. I need to go night-night. Until next time, don't let the spooks get you.